today we're going to talk about lists. Now, lists are a really nice way to organize data, and it's a way to kind of put lots of data into one variable, and that makes it very easy for you to, call certain data, call certain values, and all you have to do is just access one variable, and you don't have to spread it out over, 10 different variables if you have 10 different pieces of data. Let's just write out a list and get a more intuitive understanding. So let's just write out a list first, though. And the first list that we're going to write, we'll just call it test list. So that's our variable name that we're going to save it in. And we're going to assign it the value. And then to start a list, we open and close square brackets, and everything inside is a list. And then the first value would, for example, be element 1. So that will be the first value, and then to make a second value we would put a comma, which acts as a separator. So this indicates that we're now going to put in the second element, or that the two elements are separate. And then so our second value would, for example, be element 2. And then we can put in a third value even, for example, just by putting another comma. And then we put in element 3. And so this is kind of the general structure of a list, that you start and you end with square braces, and then each element has its own segment, and it's separated by commas. Yeah, so let's just comment this out, and let's leave this up here so that we can always refer back to it and kind of remember. And there's also a way to count through lists, so each element has a specific number. So if we go to the same test list, and we look at the numbers, and then we just make a list by indicating with the square brackets, then the first element would actually have a specific index, and in programming we start counting at 0. So the index of the first element would be 0. And then for the second element, it would have an index 1, so now we're just counting up. The third element, for example, would have the index 2. But this isn't really, so right now we've created a list that contains the elements 0, 1, and 2, but we'll also just be referring back to this to kind of look at indexes and accessing elements in lists. So we'll just also keep this up here, and we'll just be referring back to this, and the more we go through the code, the more we go through this lesson, the more this stuff up here is going to make sense, and we'll just keep referring back to it, and yeah, at the end we'll hopefully understand all of this. Okay, so let's create our first real list. And let's make it interesting, and let's say, well, we want to have, we have, say, 5 students in a class, and we want to group all of their test scores together. So we'll just make a list, and we'll save it in the variable scores. And so the variable scores is going to have the value of the list, and we indicate that we want to start a list by opening and closing square brackets. And now everything inside this is going to be part of the list. So let's say the first student got a score of 70. So then we type in 70. And now the next student, so indicating that the next number is going to be a new element, we'll put a comma. So let's say our next student got a score of 85. Then our next student, so we put in another comma to indicate that now there's going to be a new element. Our next student got a score of 67.5. And then our fourth student, so another comma to indicate that we're now going to put in a new value. Let's say they got a score of 90. And then our last student, so now we have 4 elements and we have 5 students, so we'll just put in another comma. And our last student also got a score of 80. So what we've done here is, in the variable scores, we've saved the list, and so we indicate that it's a list because we open and close square brackets around the values. And the first element has value 70. The second element has value 85. The third element has value 67.5. The fourth element has value 90. And the fifth element has value 80. And we can see that they're different elements because they're separated by commas. And you'll notice here that I put the dot for decimal, so this is all one element. 67.5 is one element, and it's in between commas. So yeah, the commas are the separators here. and the dot is just used for decimal notation here. Okay, so before we continue on, let's just print this out and see what it looks like when we print it. So we'll run this, and what we get is we get the same thing that we see here. So we open and close square brackets around our elements, which indicates that it's a list, and our first element is 70, which we have here. Then we have 85, then we have 67.5, then we have 90, and then we have 80. And now the cool thing, for example, with lists is that I can access each element individually. So let's say I want to access the first element. Well, how would I do that? So to access an element, you would type in the variable name here, like we have here, and then we would put square brackets at the end. So big distinction, here we have our variable name and then an equal sign and square brackets, which means that we're creating a list and we're assigning a value to this variable, and that value is a list. But if we put the square brackets directly behind the variable's name without the equal sign, that means we want to access an element of that list. And so in programming, we start counting at 0, and so the first element would actually have index 0. So if we want to access the first element, we would put in a 0. So that's also why we have the 0 up here. So the first element has index 0, the second element would have index 1, the third element would have index 2, and so on. But let's just go through a couple of these and get a really nice intuitive understanding. So let's just print this out. Let's see what we get, and then let's make sense of it. So what we get is 70. So why do we get 70? Well, in our print function here, we go into the variable scores, and we say we want to take out the first element, so the element with index 0. That's our first element. And so what we get is all of this gets replaced by the first element here, which is 70. And so that's why we see 70 here. Now, if we say want to take out the second element, then we put in a 1. So our second element has an index 1, since we start counting at 0 in programming. So it would be 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Yeah, so if we run this, we're going to get 85, and that's our second element. Now we can do the same thing, for example, to access the third one. And so the third one would have index 2, so 0, 1, 2. And so this would give us our third element. Our fourth element has index 3, so 0, 1, 2, 3. Index 3 corresponds to our fourth element. And so we get 90, which is our fourth element. And our fifth element has index 4, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, which is our fifth element. So we get 80, which is our last element, or the fifth element. Now, let's say we don't have a list like 5 here, but let's say we have a list of 100. Rather than typing in 99 here or something, if we had a list of 100, to access the last element, we could also just type in -1. So if we want to access the last element of this list, we can either type in 4, like we did here, and we get 80, or we can type in -1. And so the way the counting works like this is that we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or we have 0, -1, -2, -3, -4, -5. So let's just see this. So we can see that we also get 80 here. And what we're doing is we're just kind of counting backwards now. So if we put in -2, for example, we'll get the second last element, which is 90. So the last element, the second last element. -3 would give us the third last element, which is 67.5 here. -4 would give us the fourth last element, which is 85. And -5 would give us the fifth last element, which in our case is also the first element, which is 70. So -5 and, for example, 0 both correspond to the same element right here. But they don't always have to, because -5 means the fifth last, and 0 means the first element. But in this case, they're the same. So what happens, for example, if we put in -6? Well, we're going to get an error, and that's because we're trying to access the sixth last element, but there is no sixth last element. And so the error that it tells us is list index out of range. But what that means in human speak is that we're trying to access something that's not in our list. So the element is not in our list. We're trying to access something that's too big. So there is no sixth last element, and so we can't access it. We would get the same thing if we put in 5. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So our last element has index 4. And now if we try to call index 5, well, there is no index 5. So we're going to get the same error. And this may be important for you to, at least know or have in the back of your mind for later. Because if you ever see this, then you'll know, the number that I'm putting in here, it's too big, and it can't find it inside this list. So it's also important that the numbers inside here correspond from the starting and all the way to the end value of the indices. So you always start counting at 0. That's always your first value. And then your last value is just, you can just kind of count it out, or it's the number of elements minus 1, since we start counting at 0. So if we have 5 elements, for example, then the last index would be 4. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So those are all the numbers that would fit in there. Another cool thing that we could do, for example, is we can access multiple numbers. So we can kind of pick out a subsection. So let's say we want to access the first and the second element. Well, what we can do is we can say, well, we want to start at 0, and then we're going to want to go up to, and now it's to indicate that we want to go up to, but not including, is a colon. So if we type in our variable name and then put the square brackets behind it, indicating that we want to access an element, and then we put in our starting value, and we go up to, but not including. So if, let's say we want to get out the first 2 values, we want to go 0, 1, so we want 0 and 1, which means we go up to, but not including 2. So this would be, we start at 0, and this colon here means that we go up to, but not including 2. So we would have 0 and 1. So if we run this, what we get is we get a smaller list here that contains the first and the second element. Now if we expanded this, for example, to be up to, but not including the element with index 3, so the fourth element, we would get the first 3 elements. So 70, 85, and 65. So 70, 85, and 65. Now let's say we don't want the first element, but we want to start at the second one. Well, then we just change our starting value to the corresponding index. So to take, for example, the second element, our starting value would be index 1. So 0, 1, and we go up to, but not including index 3. So 0, 1 is where we start, 2 including, and 3, so up to, but not including this index or this element. So what we're going to get is we're going to get 85 and 67.5 in a smaller list. Now, if we want to start somewhere in the middle, let's say we want to start at our third element, so we put in 2, and we want to go all the way to the end, well, we just take away the ending value. And what we're going to get is we're going to get our starting value, and then we're going to get the list all the way to the end. So in this case, we start at index 2, so 0, 1, 2, and then we go all the way to the end. So this one included and this one included. And now we reach the end of our list. And so what we get is everything starting from the third element, so the element with index 2, all the way to the end of our list. So if we, for example, started with the element with index 1, so our second element, so 0, 1, we'll get everything starting from the second element to the end of the list. Cool. Okay. So let's just comment this out so that we don't see any output later. And now lists have a lot more cool features. So for example, something else that I can do with lists is that I can change the values inside. So let's say, my student got a score of 70, but he also answered the bonus question, which gave him 5 extra points. so I have to correct the score of the first student. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and type in my variable name, which contains the list, and then I'm going to access the first element just like I did up here. So I access it by putting the square brackets around the variable name, and then putting the index of the element that I want to access, and then I'm just going to assign it a new value. So in this case, it would be 75 because he got the 5 extra bonus points. And now, if we print scores, so if we print our variable which contains the list, what we're going to see is we're going to see our first element has a value of 75 rather than 70. So if we print scores before and after the change, then we can compare it. So we started at 70, and now here we access the first element, which we did by putting the square brackets behind the variable that contains the list, and then putting the index of the element here. In this case, the first element, so index 0, and we change the value to 75. Now we can also change the value to 65, for example, like we did here. We can change it to 6. We can change it to 6.0. All of this is going to work. We can even completely change it. We don't even have to keep it as a number. We can also change it to a word, for example. So this wouldn't really make any sense right now for scores, but we could technically also just put in hello, for example. And so what we see here is one of the really cool things about lists is that lists don't have to have one specific type. Like just because one of these elements here is a number, that doesn't mean the rest have to be numbers. So like we see here we have a string, here we have an integer, here we have a floating point number or a decimal number. So each element is different. And that's also really cool and useful to remember, so you can kind of group relevant information. And as long as you can make sense of it, it doesn't really matter what they are. So each element can be different. The whole point of lists is to help you group your data together and have it in a nice, accessible format for you. But let's just keep it at numbers for now. So we'll put it back to 75. Okay. Cool. So now what happens, for example, if we want to take out some numbers? So let's say our second and our third students don't want to have their test scores counted, so we have to remove them. How are we going to do that? Well, we can do it just like we did here. So we're going to go into the variable that contains our list, and we're going to access the elements that we want to access. So in this case, we would start at 85, and we want to go up to, but not including, the 90. So that would be, we start at 85, which is 0, 1, and we go up to, but not including, 0, 1, 2, 3. So the fourth element, which has index 3. So we go, and we access the element starting at index 1, and we go up to, but not including, the element with index 3. And what we're going to do to erase it is just, we assign it a new value, and this value is just open and close square brackets, which you can kind of think of, or which is actually an empty list. But this is how we can delete the values. So if we run this, what we get is we get 70, 85, 67.5, 90, and 80 as our initial scores. And what we did is we took out the scores of our second element, which has index 1, and our third element, which has index 2, since we go up to, but not including the fourth element, which has index 3. So we start at 0, 1, and then we go up to, but not including index 3. So 0, 1, and then 1, 2, 3. So we go up to, but not including this one, and we start here. So what we do is we take these two, and we replace it by an empty list. And what that does, as we can see here, is it actually deletes it. Now, let's say our second student says, well, actually, my test score wasn't that bad. I want to keep it in. But the third student says, I still don't want my test score counted. Well, what we can do then, for example, is, well, our starting value is going to change now. So our second student, which has index 1, is no longer going to be counted. So we'll start at our third student, which has index 2. and we'll go up to, but not including the fourth student. So we start here at index 2, so 0, 1, 2, and we go up to, but not including our fourth student, which has index 3, so 0, 1, 2, 3. So if we start here and go up to, but not including this, all we're left with is this. And so the format is the same. We just replace it by an empty list. And if we run this and print it, then we see that we've taken out this value. Now, what would happen, for example, if you forgot to say, oh, let's start at our element with index 2 and go up to, but not including the element with index 3? What if you just did this? Oh, I'm going to replace my element with index 2, so the third element, with an empty list. What you're going to get is you're actually going to get an empty list in here rather than deleting it. And so this really shows that a list can really contain anything. So it can contain strings like we had, so words here. It can contain numbers, all types, decimal numbers, integer numbers, but it can also contain lists again. And so here, for example, I can put in different values again. So here I can put in, for example, my first value, I can put in the string hello, or the word hello, and then I can put in the second element, which I do by having a comma here, indicating that I want to have a new element. And then I can put in, for example, world as my second element. And if I run this, what I'm going to get is I'm going to start with this list, and it's going to be changed to this. So what happened is my third element, the element with index 2, was replaced by this list. So the list that contains the elements hello and world. But this list is still just one element, and if we want, we can access it. So let's say we want to print the third element, the element with index 2. So we do that. We put in the print function, and we put inside the variable here, and then we open and close the square brackets behind the variable name to indicate that we want to access the element, and then we put in the number or the index of the element that we want to access, in this case 2. So if we run this, we can see we'll just follow the whole thought process. So we started with our original list, which we defined here, and we print it. Then we change the element with index 2, which is the third element. We change this one, so 0, 1, 2, to a list containing hello and world, like this. So now our third element is a list in and by itself. And now we print the third element, and so we actually get a list again. And now you may be wondering, well, can I access these elements? And if so, how? Well, yes, you can. So if you want to access the third or the first element in this list, so the first element in the third element of this list, well, what you do is you put another open and close square brackets behind here. And then we put in our index of the element that we want to access, in this case 0, which corresponds to the first element. And now if we run this, we can see that we get hello here. So what did we do? Well, here we're printing our original list as we defined it here. So we just print it. Then we change the third element to the list containing the elements hello and world. And they're two elements because they're separated by a comma. So our third element, 67.5, got changed to the element hello world, a list that contains hello and world. And now we access the third element in our list contained in scores, which is this list. And inside of our third element, or inside this list, we access the first element, or the element with index 0, which in this case is hello. And so if we want to access the second element, for example, we just type in the index 1, and if you run it again, we get world. So now we've accessed the second element here. Cool. So as you can see, you can put lists inside of lists. You can really just put anything inside. And I'm just going to reiterate this several times. It's just lists are really, really great and useful because I've stored so much data into just one variable. And if I kind of know what or where my data is or how it's organized, then I can access it very easily and I don't need to create a bunch of different variables. I can just store it all in one variable, and I can access it very systematically and everything. But there is still more that we can do with lists. So let's just take this out for now, and let's just stick with our original list. So we'll take these print ones out too. So if we run this, all we have left is just our original list, and we're printing them. And now something else that you can do, for example, is, well, if you have someone that was, if we had a student, for example, that was sick during our test, but then took the test later, we have to add the score to the list too. And we want it all to be in the same list. And we don't want to create a completely new list. So what do? We want to add the score probably to the end of the list. So what we're going to do is we're going to append the score to the list. And so it goes exactly like that. We type in our variable name that contains the list, or we type in the list here, and then we put a dot, and then we type in append. And we'll go through this all in detail in a second, so don't worry. And then we put in the value that we want to append. So let's say our sixth student retook the test or took the test later, and they got a value of 82. So what we're going to do is we're going to append 82 to the list contained inside the variable scores. So the syntax is we have our variable name, and then we want to put a dot, which means we want to do something to this, and then we type here what we want to do. And since this is kind of a function, which we will also cover, we just have to put in the value inside the brackets afterwards. So that's kind of the syntax. We have the variable or the list that we want to add something to. We put in a dot indicating that we want to do something to it. Then we type in what we want to do, in this case append, and then we put the value in brackets behind the append that we want to add to the end of the list. So let's just print out our new list and see how it looks like. So we can see here, this is our original list that we created, that we print up here. And now, after we append 82 to scores, and we print scores again, we see that 82 was added to the end of the list. And so this is really cool too. That means your list size can also be modified. So just because you only have 2 elements in it, for example, in the beginning, doesn't mean you can't add on values later. So, for example, if you know, or if you write a program and you only know a couple of values in the beginning, but some values will pop up later because, for example, a user will put them in, you can always just add them to your list and just add them on and on in the end. So lists are, it's really great what you can do with lists and everything, and they're just such a nice way to keep track of all your data and to really organize it, and you can make it bigger. Like we saw here, you can add elements to it. You can delete like we did before. Well, we don't have it here anymore, but if you would take out this, then here, for example, we would be, and we make this, so 2 up to 3. So here we would, for example, be deleting the third element, so the element with index 2, up to but not including the element with index 3. So here we would be deleting our third element. Here we would be adding an element to the end of the list. We also looked before at how to change elements, how to modify the data inside. We saw that we can really put anything inside. We have numbers here, we've got integers, we've got the decimals, we've got lists, we've got words or strings like they're called in programming. So we can really just do anything to them. We can put whatever we want inside. It's just really made for us to be able to use it and to be able to organize our data very effectively.